Everyone. This is the first of 3 videos we're going to be doing on the final text we're studying in this course, which is the novel Everything is Illuminated. So in this first video, I'm going to be putting it into some context and also taking us through some of the plot confusions. It's a pretty bewildering read, this, at least the first read. And deliberately so, but anyway, hopefully at the end of this video it'll seem a bit clearer about what's going on. In the next video we'll look at the sort of postmodern aspects of this in terms of intertextuality. We've got so many different texts which are sort of interlacing with each other, so I'll take you through that and explain why that's happening. And then in the third video we'll look at what this novel is saying about photography. So that's kind of what we're doing. So to begin today, let's just revise our notion of subject identity. What does it actually mean? So what is a subject? A subject is a person, at least in this sense. And subject identity then is that person's notion of who-ness, of personhood, of who they are as a person. And this, of course, draws on a number of disparate elements pertaining to, I guess, constructions of gender, of ethnicity, of religion, of kinship, family, nation, you know, you get it. But it also, of course, is comprised of our particular skill sets, proclivities, ambitions, desires, and needs. And some of these elements implicate us in, I suppose, what we can call a broader communal or shared memory sort of bank, right? And as we grow up, we become more aware of ourselves as being, well, I mean, in my case, what am I? I'm English, male, Caucasian, British, European, a very bad Catholic, right? So, you know, and so we create signifiers, which sort of come from this memory bank of signifiers, if you like. I make this point because I think that the subject identity of a Jew implicates them, or that person, that subject, in a cultural memory bank which is predominantly a sorrowful one. I mean, okay, so we can all, I guess, drill back into communal memories that are painful. Although I suppose as an Englishman, my problem there is that the English seem to spend most of their time doing bad things to other people in the past. But anyway, you get my point. But yeah, if you're Jewish, it doesn't matter how far back in time you go or where you stop the clock, you encounter different iterations of anti-Semitism. Semitism is a difficult word, but for our purposes, anti-Semitism can be taken to mean anti-Jewishness, and by no means is that a special property of the Nazis. I mean, you know that, right? Of course you do. You know, go back to the exodus of the Jews, 1250 BC from Egypt, or 597 BC, the expulsion of the Jews from Judah. I was really surprised researching this to encounter the, not anti-Semitism in English history. I knew, of course, that there had been, but the extent of it, there was was it 1290, Edward I expelled the Jews from England. And that law remained in place for over 350 years. I mean, holy shit. You have the massacre of Spanish Jews in 1391. I mean, it's unending and everywhere. And under Catherine the Great in 1791, the Jewish Pale was established. So let me just show a picture of that. And this lasted until the end of the First World War, the Russian Revolution, so 1917. And yeah, so you can see this is where you basically had to live if you were Jewish from that late 18th century for more than 100 years, extending from the Baltic states right the way down to the Black Sea and the Crimea. And living in that region, which they called the Pale, you were denied all those sort of constituent parts of what we take to be our rights, our civil rights. I mean, you were denied any access to a civic education, to jobs, to health. I mean, life was just bloody difficult. You made the best of it, and a lot of the Jews who populated the Pale did so in these little settlements that were called shtetls. And of course, we see Drakenbrod as an example of that in this novel. Okay. So the novel takes us over and over again to this experience, to this communal memory, which is a sorrowful one. And there are different ways in which it is represented in the book, sometimes sort of factually, sometimes metaphorically. One place I want to take you to is on 197, 198. So these are entries in the Book of Antecedents, which I'll come to in the next video. And then on 198, at the bottom here, we have an entry which says Jews have 6 senses: touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing, and then memory. While Gentiles experience and process the world through the traditional senses and use memory only as a second-order means of interpreting events, for Jews, memory is no less primary than the prick of a pin, or its silver glimmer, or the taste of the blood it pulls from the finger. The Jew is pricked by a pin and remembers other pins. It's only by tracing the pinprick back to other pinpricks, when his mother tried to fix his sleeve while his arm was still in it, when his grandfather's fingers fell asleep from stroking his great-grandfather's damp forehead, when Abraham tested the knife point to be sure Isaac would feel no pain, that the Jew is able to know why it hurts. When a Jew encounters a pin, he asks, what does it remember like? And I guess the answer is, well, it remembers like a knife or like a gas chamber. So memory here is a sense of pain. That's almost the construction of memory in this. But happily, the novel is not just an account or an exploration of that sorrowful memory. It is also a celebration of Jewish life in all of its, one might say, absurdities. And this reminds me of the distinction that the author makes between the fundamentalists and the non-fundamentalists. And we have the difference between the upwriters and the slouchers, which are all to do with this idea of hanging onto a rope, climbing up the rope to get closer to God while you're holding on to the holy book, and then a fly turns up and pesters them. And the rabbi is saying, you know, don't let go, don't let go. Let's just have a look at that. This is page 17. Halfway down 17, and they screamed now, never allowing the baby a moment of rest, and hung with one hand on prayer book and one on rope from the pulleys that clipped to their belts and kept the crowns of their black hats brushing against the ceiling. And if we aspire to be closer to God, the venerable rabbi had enlightened, should we not act like it, and should we not make ourselves closer? So we have the pestering fly, and the rabbi screams out, and as God asked Abraham to show Isaac the knife's point, so he's asking us not to scratch our asses, and if we must, by all means, with the left hand. So the ones who did what they were told and kept hold of the book collapsed to the ground, and then they affected a limp for the rest of their lives. And those who dropped the prayer book rather than fall were the ancestors of the slouching synagogue's congregants. So we have this distinction at the bottom here of 18, save for those rare occasions when uprisers and slouchers pushed at the synagogue from opposite sides, trying to make the shtetl more sacred or secular, they learned to ignore each other. Okay. Why are we studying this novel, you may be asking? Well, the first thing to say is I am not a Jew, so there's no sort of hidden agenda there. I think 3 reasons, and I kind of indicated it at the beginning of the video. So firstly, I think because the novel takes as its central theme, our central theme, which is memory and subject identity. And the two are exemplified, the link between the two is exemplified in Jewish subject identity. So that's the first reason. Secondly, because I think it's a very clever postmodern novel in the way that it gives us intertextuality. And in the way that it illustrates that subject identity is dependent on the untamable and unreliable signifying chain that we're now so familiar with. And thirdly, we're studying this novel because of the way that its plot turns on 2 key photographs. One, which we can call the Augustine photograph, and the other, which we can call the Herschel photograph. And a lot of the things we've been exploring in photography, these different identities, subject positions, and Barth's notion of punctum and studium and unary, all of this is going to help us to understand what Jonathan Safran Foer is doing in this novel. So that's, I think in many ways it's sort of bringing together everything that we've been looking at so far. To further our analysis and try and sort out some of the confusions, I thought it would be a good idea for us to have a look at some family trees here. There are 3 significant family trees, and then there's a weird 4th tree that I'll come to. So let's just bring this up now. What we're going to find with these trees, and the notion of a family tree itself is a kind of typological memory, isn't it? It's a way in which we process a type of memory and see it in the form of a tree, or systematize it. So here is Alex's tree, and we discover that his grandfather's parents died together. We're not exactly told how, but let's have a look at page 111. So there they are in the field, and I inquired grandfather, it's about 2/3 of the way down 111. I inquired grandfather about this because I also did not find it canny. It's canny, he said, in the fields you toil until you're not able to toil. Your great-grandfather died in the fields. Did great-grandmother work in the fields? She was working with him when he died. So presumably that was some kind of tragic and horrific death, but we're not told. And there's a lot we're not told in these trees. It's like there's a lot of blurring. a lot of uncertainty, and this is entirely deliberate, of course. Now, the grandfather is Eli, okay? But he calls himself Alex or Alexander. And so this is an example of the slippage that's happening often in this novel with subject identity, with signifiers, okay? And in this particular case, it's a very good example of confabulation. Remember, we came across this in Travesties with Car. It's where you sort of create memory. But the creation comes out of your current, present desires and appetites and feelings and fears. So, page 5, we're told that the grandfather's name is Alexander. Grandfather's name is also Alexander. And we're told that he was born or sired in Odessa in 1918. Okay. But we discover subsequently that something terrible and traumatic happened during the war that affected the grandfather. The grandfather was friends with Herschel. And this is revealed to us because Herschel is recognized in the photograph by the old woman, by Lister, who they think is Augustine, but it's not, it's Lister, okay? Let's look at 152. Here is Herschel, she said, halfway down 152, holding a photograph up to the light of the window. We will go, grandfather said. Tell him we're leaving. Do not go, she said. Shut up, he told her. So he's reacting immediately. He lived in Kolki, which was a shtetl near to Trachenbrod. Herschel and Eli were best friends, and Eli had to shoot Herschel because if he did not, they would shoot him. Shut up, said he again, and he punched the table, but she did not shut up. Eli did not want to, but he did. The photograph in Lister's remains case, which the guys look at when they get to the bar, shows, if you like, pins down the grandfather because it shows him, Eli, grandmother, the father, Alex's father, and Herschel together. This is on page 228. Here is Lister saying, the woman in the photograph is your grandmother. She's holding your father. The man standing next to me was our best friend, Herschel. The woman in the photograph is my grandmother. She's holding my father. The man standing next to me. So this is the repetition of that. Herschel is wearing a skull cap in the photograph because he was a Jew, and he was my best friend, and I murdered him. So, we have a character, a subject, trying to avoid the trauma of an event, his responsibility in this case, and not responsibility. What a terrible choice and dilemma to be put into. And he's displacing, he's creating a new subject identity by creating a new name, Alexander. And I think the word Alex itself is no accident. I mean, we're dealing with an absolute genius novelist here. And can you believe this was his first novel? Because the word lex is word in Latin. So Alex is a deliberately chosen signifier here, which is just reminding us that this is so much to do with text and language and signifiers. Okay, as for the grandmother, all I can pick up here is that her name is Anna. We find that out on page 248. Let's look now at another family tree. This is Brod's tree. And we're going to find more of the same thing, more of this notion of signifiers spinning off in different directions and multiple identities, okay? So Yankel is married, but his wife goes off with another man, and Yankel is the name of this other man. So Yankel was previously called Safran, right? He calls himself now Yankel after this other guy. So, I mean, that's page 47, so let's just get that. Yeah, 46 at the top. He'd even lost the name. He was Safran before he fled the shtetl. And then across the page. After 3 years, he returned to the shtetl. And he had to wear this horrible bead around his neck as a mark of his shame. He changed his name to Yankel, the name of the bureaucrat who ran away with his wife, and asked that no one ever call him Safran again. Okay, so he then finds himself having to look after this young baby. And so he figures, okay, well, the best thing to do here is to create a mother for her, a wife, and a story. And so we have a fictive wife that he creates. And 48, next page, the funny thing here is that he falls in love with her. In a sense, Yankel falls in love with a pure signifier. So this is what's happening. Yankel made up a story about her mother's early death, page 48. Painless in childhood. And answered the many questions that arose in the way he felt would cause her the least pain. So it's an act of love, why he's done this. He told Brod of vacations he and his wife had taken and put her to bed with stories of their romance. And at the bottom here, it was inevitable. Yankel fell in love with his never-wife. He would wake from sleep to miss the weight that never depressed the bed next to him, remember in earnest the weight of gestures she never made, long for the unweight of her unarmed slung over his too real chest, making his widower's remembrances that much more convincing and his pain that much more real. He felt that he'd lost her. He had lost her. At night, he would reread the letters she'd never written him. And it almost worked. Brod, more than any other character in this novel, gives us multiple signifiers and multiple identities. So she is this miraculous baby who just kind of appears out of the waters of this river after Traken's wagon has gone careening into it. So we have this miraculous birth, page 16. And the baby at the top here, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, this is a more difficult problem, for it's relatively easy to reason how a life could be lost in a river, but for one to arise from it. She is named after the river by Yankel, so that's her name, Brod. We have this on page 47. But she also becomes text and textual personified river. So this is kind of set up for us on page 43 in a rather nice way, I think. So at the bottom of 43, Yankel made a bed of crumpled newspaper in a deep baking pan and gently tucked it in the oven so that she wouldn't be disturbed by the noise of the small falls outside. He left the oven door open and would sit for hours and watch her, as one might watch a loaf of bread rise. He watched her chest rise and fall in rapid succession as her fingers made fists and released, and her eyes squinted for no apparent reason. Could she be dreaming, he wondered? And if so, what would a baby dream of? When he pulled her out to feed her or just hold her, her body was tattooed with newsprint. So, I mean, literally then, she's taken out of the oven covered in text. She is text in that sense, and then we see in a more profound and metaphoric sense, she becomes the river itself. Let's go to page 272. The bombing. And then this entry. The dream of the end of the world. Bombs poured down from the sky, exploding across Trachenbad in bursts of light and heat. And those watching the festivities hollered, ran frantically. They jumped into the bubbling, splashing, frantically dynamic water, not after the sack of gold, but to save themselves. They stayed under as long as they could. They surfaced to seize air and look for loved ones. My Saffron picked up his wife and carried her like a newlywed into the water, which seemed, amid the falling trees and hackling, crackling explosions, the safest place. Hundreds of bodies poured into the Broad, that river with my name. I embraced them. And open arms come to me. I wanted to save them all, to save everybody from everybody. The bombs rained, and so it continues. And then the bottom of the next page, 273. Babies, there's a desperate mass of babies, children, teenagers, adults, elderly, all pulled at each other to survive, but pulled each other into me, drowning each other, killing each other. The bodies began to rise one at a time until I couldn't be seen through all of the bodies, blue skin open. I was the carcass. They were the butterflies. So yeah, I mean, we see here how Broad is taking on metaphoric, personified form of the river, animated form of the river. And I think this is also suggested, her textual presence, shall we say, Broad's textual presence is also suggested in these wavy, you notice this? These wavy kind of titles we have to the chapters is suggestive of river. So she's, if you like, Broad is here telling us the story. She's personified in text. It's reminding me of that surrealist poem we looked at by Antonin Artaud, where he says, you know, I'm with you right now because I'm in my words that you're reading. So think of it like this. We have signifier Broad equals signified, and then we've got multiple signified. So we have Broad as miraculous child, Broad as young woman, as mother, and ultimately as the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jonathan Safran Foer. We're told that on page 75, okay? Broad as river, Broad as metaphor, Broad as text. This is slipping and slipping into each other. This is her subject identity, such as it is, as we can identify it threading throughout the novel. The Kulka, I'm going to say quite a bit more about when we get to video 3 and their relationship. He is named Safran. We know this on page 136, and he comes back to sort of life as a statue or the dial. We encounter that on page 263. So more on the Kulka down the track. Now then, let's look at the Jonathan Safran Foer tree. Jonathan Safran Foer's grandmother, we discover, escaped from Kalki just before the war and ends up in America, right? His grandfather, Safran, we're told, also ended up in America after the war and died, page 98. Yeah, so he died only 5 weeks after coming to the States. Just half a year after my mother was born. Okay, so that's the little detail we have there. Now, the first wife, Safran's first wife, is Zoja. Page 154. Okay, well, this is Lister's reminiscence of the wedding description of Zosia. And if you remember, Saffron is the guy with the withered arm. He's a bit of a nefarious character, a kind of Lothario, Don Juan lover. It seems partly because of his withered arm. He has sex with Zosia's sister on the day of his wedding to Zosia. And it's I think this moment when the bombs start exploding, okay? So that's page 253. Don't think I need to go there right now. No. And we discover that because of his arm, he was unable to save Zosia and their child when the Nazis attacked. So page 166, I think we should go there. Yeah, this is about his arm. And there's a nice passage here about photography we'll come back to. And it was because his arm died that he never worked at the menacing flour mill, but in the tannery just outside the shtetl, and that he was exempted from the draft that sent his schoolmates off to be killed in hopeless battles against the Nazis. His arm would save him again when it kept him from swimming back to Trachenbrod to save his only love, who died in the river with the rest of them. So that's Zosia. And again, when it kept him from drowning himself. His arm saved him again when it caused Augustine to fall in love with him and save him. And that's the Augustine in the picture that sort of triggers the journey of Jonathan Safran Foer. It is Augustine, this girl who we never really find out who she is, who saves Safran somehow. Okay, now, Safran is, I think, the probable father, it seems, of another child. This one with Lister, the old woman they think is Augustine, but it's actually Lister. And Lister, of course, thinks she has a baby, but it looks as though there was a horrific incident when she was shot in the womb and lost her child. Let's piece this together bit by bit, and you'll see why I'm saying this. So 153, we have the union of Safran, grandfather here, with Lister. Yeah, so I presented her the photograph again. Of course, she said, and again dispersed her eyes to me, that was Safran. He was the first boy I ever kissed. I'm such an old lady that I'm too old to be shy anymore. I kissed him when I was only a girl, and he was only a boy. So that, it kind of starts there. There's a reference to 2 babies here. He lost a wife and 2 babies, you know, in the war. So you think, well, who, you know, how 2 babies? Well, one is Zosia's child, lost in the river, and the other one, I think, is the child that Lister lost, because it seems that Lister had sex with Safran. If we go to page 170, here, he was invited by his schoolmate to a play. His ticket corresponded to a seat that was already taken by Lister, who he recognized as the young widow. She was beautiful, so on and so forth. And then on 172, top of the page, 2 years and 68 lovers later, Safran understood that the tears of blood left on Lister's sheets were virginal tears. So that suggests the consummation, and therefore suggests how there could be a baby. Lister, just to trace this through, has this strange walk which suggests an injury. 146. And of course she's called Augustine by these guys. She had a very unusual walk. She could not move any faster than slow. She looked like she had a leg that was damaged goods. Well, it seems she was shot, right? She says that she has a baby girl. Page 182. I have a baby girl. And then we have this very disturbing incident of the shooting. Now, Lister describes it as though it's her sister who's been shot. Halfway down, 187. My sister, I told you, was not dead. They left her there on the ground after they shot her in her place. She started to crawl away. She could not use her legs, but she pulled herself with her arms and hands. And 193. I must go in and care for my baby. It is missing me. So, in a way that's quite disturbing here, and I think it's similar to what Alex's grandfather is doing. Lister is displacing a trauma, and we know now, I think, what the traumatic event was, and she's displacing her identity in the form of her sister. She can't recount this happening to herself, and so she displaces it as if it's happened to her sister. And tragically, she seems trapped in the memory. She seems trapped in that traumatic moment, as if the baby is still alive, and as if the war is still going on. I mean, she doesn't even know that the war has ended. So, okay, we'll come back to Lister, particularly in video 3 here, the third video, when we talk about photographs. The final tree I want to talk about today is what I call the signifying tree here at the bottom. This extraordinary tree of memory that we're given on page 259. Here it is, this thing here, which I'm sure you remember sort of thinking, wow, when you saw it. So basically, it's a kind of collage, a tree of disparate elements, flotsam, jetsam, whatever it is, that sort of came up from when the wagon, Tracken's wagon, crashed into the river. All this stuff came to the surface, and so a lot of it is to do with that. We have references to strings here. Strings are suggestive of memory traces and engrams. I mean, we actually have a reference to Theseus and the labyrinth here at the top of the page, right? So the problem is kind of in sort of deciphering this is that there doesn't seem to be any center. It seems to be an origin tree, an origin of the community of Trackenbrod. But origin stories tend to have an absence at the center. Or at the very beginning. What we do have here at the center is this future predicated statement, I will. It's almost as though it's at the center pushing out. And this, I think, is key to the book, to everything that Jonathan Safran Foer is writing about and wanting us to take from this book. And let's piece this together, because I think it's quite clever the way he does this. Page 8, we have the first iteration, presence of this signifying phrase, I will. Here we are, page 8. So we've got the wagon crashing in, and we have the curious flotsam rising to the surface, wandering snakes of white string, a crushed velvet glove with outstretched fingers, barren spools, schmutzy pince nez, ras da 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 da, and the bleeding red ink script of a resolution. I will, in italics, I will. Now, let's go from there to page 216. And we see this phrase repeating again. I would like to borrow your currency, he said. In truth, I felt very shamed. And then, I will, I said. And I should have uttered nothing more and allowed my I will to speak for everything that I've ever had to say to grandfather, for the I will to be all of my questions and all of his answers to those questions and all of my answers to those questions. Okay, from there to page 233. Here at the bottom, another reference to the river, the flotsam rising to the surface, wandering snakes of white string, the crushed velvet glove, a bleeding red ink script of a resolution, I will, so it's returning to us there. 256. Towards the bottom here, he thought about the legend of Trachim, about where his body might be, and from where it once came. He thought about Trachim's wagon, the wandering snakes of white string, the crushed velvet glove with outstretched fingers, the resolution, I will. From there to page 269. At the top here, their floats were adorned with thousands of butterflies and alluded to aspects of the Trachim story, the wagon, the twins, the bleeding red ink script, I will, and then we get to the very end of the novel. And here it is. Do you understand me? I will walk without noise, and I will open the door in darkness, comma, and I will. And it's just left hanging. Why? What I think is that we are being conjoined, encouraged by Jonathan Safran Foer to finish that sentence. And presumably what he wants us to say is, I will not forget. I think that's the point of the whole novel. Okay. I want to leave it there. Hopefully, it's all just a little bit clearer what's going on. And then it will become clearer still when we get into the next video and we'll start to explore all these different texts and how they interlace with each other. All right, okay, thank you for your time, and I'll see you next time.